what's the big story here that may not be grabbing the headlines?
I think the big story, Aaron, is the struggle over sort of who is the hegemonic or the dominant power in the region, especially within the so-called Sunni or Muslim Orthodox world. President Trump chose Saudi Arabia as the first country to visit, and that irritated Mr. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, who basically suggested that Turkey should have been the first destination for the U.S. president because it has the 17th largest economy in the world, and it's a member of NATO, and it's an old ally of the United States, and it has a much more functional political system in the region. And there was an irritation, a sense of irritation in Ankara that Turkey was not viewed as the first-rate power in the region by Washington. So Turkey has been deep down very happy with the fact that Saudis have been embarrassed by the murder of Mr. Khashoggi, and that now they have really a card that they can use to embarrass the Saudi royal family.
And what is the outcome, I guess? Or, well, I want to take another step back, because I thought it was interesting that here we have most of the establishment media and most of the press corps, and we talked previously about how the establishment media, especially the New York Times, got the Iranian situation so wrong. They were saying Trump was uniting the Iranians behind the regime, and then a month later the Iranians are protesting in the streets by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Right. It's been interesting to me that with all the stories of oppression coming out of Iran and the way the women in Iran have been treated, but also when it comes to Turkey in particular, I mean, wasn't it just days, if not a day before this Khashoggi story came out, that the Turks were still holding an American pastor in basically in prison or in house detention? I mean, they were still jailing an American pastor, but all of us, but that story got, compared to the Khashoggi story, got relatively little attention, and yet now all of a sudden we're just supposed to take Erdogan's word on everything now.
Exactly, and you're hitting the nail on the head. In the case of Iran, by the way, these protests have continued, and now we have massive strikes by Iranian truck drivers, by Iranian teachers. Schools have been closed for several days. Then various marketplaces, the bazaars, have been shut down. So the protest actually in Iran continues, but interestingly enough, the media does not have the time to cover them. In the case of Turkey, of course, Turkey was holding a prominent member of our religious establishment in jail, and this was almost like a hostage holding by the Turkish government, and not much attention was paid on that account, and the media more or less ignored it, but the administration managed to actually negotiate the release of the pastor, and we are very happy that he's now back. Once that happened, Turkey thought that the relationship with the United States had improved, and now it was time to teach Washington who the real ally of the United States should be, Ankara or Riyadh. And of course, in Khashoggi's situation, they found an opportunity to embarrass Saudi Arabia in the world and tell the American administration that it's Turkey with whom you should be allies rather than Saudi Arabia. But of course, remember, and my last statement on this, that the irony of all ironies is that Turkey has the highest number of journalists in jail. It is not a very democratic country anymore, and it has moved toward authoritarianism on month-to-month basis, and nobody is talking about the very, very sort of repressive record of the Erdogan administration in Ankara.
Well, that ties in with my next question. That really brings up a couple more questions, which is why, at least in terms of media coverage, it seems like this story has, and I'm not defending what happened to Khashoggi here by any means. People are going to be held accountable and things like that. But at the end of the day, I think why so much media attention is focused on this is because it's about anything they can do to criticize President Trump, and obviously the relationship that he's been trying to foster with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia in really a critical part of the world right now for the economy and everything else. But what fears should people have about Erdogan and the direction he is moving the Turkish government into? Because if they're saying, well, we should move away from a relationship with Saudi Arabia and we should be closer to Turkey, what are the fears of trusting Erdogan?
Yeah, I think you're completely right that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is really a heinous crime, and it should have never occurred. And of course, the way the Saudis handled it from the very beginning, not confronting the truth and hiding it, and then incrementally sort of releasing information here and there, and then now coming to admit it, just makes them look terrible. And it really, I think, it all emanates from one individual, and that's the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Things should have been very different in terms of approach to opposition newspapers and journalists. And of course, the Saudis have just a problem with ever allowing anyone to speak up and express himself or herself when they speak up against the regime. But this is an interesting situation because the real troubling part outside of Saudi Arabia is actually Turkey itself. It has become increasingly more repressive, intolerant, and hegemonic. It is really interfering in the internal affairs of several countries in the region, of course, one of which is Syria, where Turkish military is in occupation of part of Syria. And, of course, the other element is that they very much resent U.S. support for the Kurds, both in Iraq and Syria, and Turkey has been complaining about the U.S. support for various Kurdish organizations. So the fundamentals of Turkish foreign policy are becoming more and more oppositional to our foreign policy objectives in the region, which is, for example, helping the Kurdish people who are the victims of repressive regimes, especially in Syria today.
Yeah, that point you make, too, about all of the journalists being detained in Turkey right now. I mean, because you might say, well, the media just cares about this story more because they care more about Khashoggi than they do about the women of Iran. Well, because it's a journalist and they're going to stand up for their fellow journalists. Well, stand up for your fellow journalists who are being detained in Turkey right now. Also, what role does what do you think is behind maybe the Muslim Brotherhood and continued attempts by the Muslim Brotherhood to gain more of a foothold in the region? I know Rush Limbaugh, for example, and not that this would be necessarily excuse what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, but he said that that Khashoggi was a Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer, and there's other news outlets that have reported similar things apparently. But is there also a bigger play that's taken place where this is basically the Muslim Brotherhood trying to gain a stronger foothold in the entire region? And if they can undercut somebody who might be perceived to be a reformer like Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, that then they can also increase the Muslim Brotherhood influence in the region.
That is actually correct, because the real battle within the Islamist politics today is between the Wahhabi version of Sunni Orthodox Islam, as represented by the Saudi monarchy, and the Muslim Brotherhood, which claims to be a more reformist and a more modern version of Islamism. And as you know, the home of Muslim Brotherhood was Egypt. Then it spread from Egypt, and movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria, Hamas in Gaza, and various other, reformist Islamist groups have claimed sort of a Muslim Brotherhood heritage. There is no doubt that the woman Khashoggi was going to marry and for whom he was going to Saudi Consul General has a very strong tie to Muslim Brotherhood. This is Khadija Cengiz, who was with him as he walked into building on October 2nd. He was also in contact with the government of Qatar, and Qatar has been a big supporter through Al Jazeera of Muslim Brotherhood causes. And Khashoggi had actually denounced Saudi pressure on Qatar. And so there is this inner sort of dynamics of conflict between the Wahhabis on the one hand, as represented by Saudi Arabia, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is no doubt that Khashoggi was moving more and more toward Muslim Brotherhood or some version of Muslim Brotherhood alternative inside Saudi Arabia. And I think that is why the situation became so much more fatal in terms of the decision to eliminate him.
Just a couple minutes left here with Dr. Mehrdad Kia from the University of Montana. Always a pleasure getting the chance to hear his insight. Dr. Kia, if you had advice for the Trump administration and for the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia moving forward, what would your guidance be? Where do we go now? Now that the Crown Prince has basically said this was a heinous incident and that he will hold people, where do we go from here?
I think on the one hand, we have to make it very clear to the Saudis that this kind of behavior will be unacceptable and that they should come out with all the facts relating to the situation. We're not going to move forward unless this sort of hide-and-seek game is finished and we put all the facts out, and especially, as you know very well, in the Muslim tradition, families always demand that they have the body of a deceased person, and they have to release the facts about where his body is. On the other hand, the reality is that Saudi Arabia, beyond the Crown Prince, is an ally of the United States, and the United States needs to get back to, dealing with its own ally. And with this ally, it's a strategic ally in terms of sources of energy, petroleum, gas, and so on and so forth, but also its alliance with Saudi Arabia against Iran to contain Iran. But also Saudi Arabia is playing a major role in establishing a unique tie with Israel to address the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So for all those reasons, we have to restart this relationship, but with a new understanding that we do not tolerate this kind of criminal behavior.